Welcome to Embargoed, a podcast featuring intelligent talk about sanctions, export controls, and all things international trade for trade nerds and normal human beings alike. I am one of your hosts, Brian Fleming. I'm here, as always, with my intrepid colleague, friend, and co-host, Mr. Tim O'Toole, live from our offices in downtown DC. What's up, Tim?
Live from just above Black Lives Matter Plaza in downtown Washington, D.C. for the first time in a long time, really.
Yes.
So.
And as I was just talking off mic, I was planning to be in the office as well today, but was thwarted by a nail in my tire this morning, so did not drive into the office. I am at home as usual. But in all events, happy to be here on this sunny, cool autumn afternoon in mid-October. Thank you for joining us as always. Thanks to everybody who reached out after the last episode. As always, we have, it's odd. We were sitting down to plan this one a couple days ago, and we're like, not much has happened in the last couple weeks. And then, like in the last 3 or 4 days, there's been about 7 different things that have happened. So we're going to devote quite a bit of time to those things, many of which are sort of closely related to one another. Actually, that's going to be kind of the bulk of the show today. But yeah, it's as always, the more you are lulled into a false sense of security, the more the sanctions gods will come in and catch you by surprise if you get too comfortable. So before we get started, of course, the normal warnings that we're not giving legal advice, we're not sharing confidential information. Everything you hear today is the view and opinion of myself or Mr. O'Toole. If you disagree, blame us. If you like the pod, please subscribe. You can find us anywhere you get your pod content. Spread the word. We will be back in a couple weeks. We're kind of back to our normal schedule now, every 2 weeks. Next one will probably be up first week of November. This will be up hopefully later this week, kind of mid to late October. So without further delay, let me run down what we're going to cover today, because it is, as I said, a bit more extensive than we maybe had even planned when we were originally getting ready to do the episode. So number one, we're going to start with the announcement yesterday of the results of the Treasury sanctions review that has been underway since the early days of the Biden administration, just announced yesterday. Some testimony given by the deputy secretary today on the Hill on that report as well. We'll start there, as that I think is a useful framing device for us to think about many of the other things we're going to talk about today. Number two, we're going to cover the new OFAC guidance for the virtual currency industry that was just released late last week. We're going to pivot from there to DOJ enforcement priorities and announcements. One that is directly related, that it relates to the cryptocurrency task force that was just announced a couple weeks ago, and one more broad-based statement on DOJ priorities in the sanctions and export space. Then we're going to pivot. We're going to stay with DOJ, and we're going to talk about ZTE and its forever monitor, and whether or not they're ever going to get out from under their monitorship. Very interesting Wall Street Journal article on that topic last week for anybody who hasn't read that, and featuring quotes from a couple of my former colleagues at DOJ. And then we're going to end with our final topic, a big topic, China and Taiwan, and checking in with what is happening there and what the implications of that could be for U.S. foreign policy, and in particular U.S. trade policy. And then in the lightning round, we're going to cover 2 topics. We're going to cover the extradition of Alex Saab, who was just extradited to the U.S. From Cape Verde yesterday, and implications for Venezuela and the Maduro regime that are already being seen there. And then the final topic, our favorite, JCPOA 2.0, and whether or not it is time to play the requiem for JCPOA 2.0, given what we're seeing lately on the possibility of more talks. So that's the show. We have a lot to cover, a lot of, again, closely interrelated topics, especially those first 3. But before we get started, Tim, any big thoughts before we jump in here?
Lots to talk about, but I think it is all interrelated, so I think we're going to get through it quickly. I think this is going to be another very crisp episode of Embargoed.
The more we tell ourselves that, the more likely it is to happen. So
No, I'm not
that's
going to
the
jinx
mantra
us.
that we That's the mantra we repeat into the mirror every morning in case anybody's
Exactly.
worried, or before, or at least on episode recording days. So, all right. So without any further hold up, let's jump in. So topic number one, as I mentioned, is the results of the Treasury sanctions review that was just announced yesterday. And I think we touched on this when it was first discussed and floated very early on. Secretary Yellen and Deputy Secretary Adeyemo had spoken publicly about this and the work that was underway by Treasury in connection with interagency partners to sort of look at, in essence, the role of the sanctions tool as a U.S. foreign policy mechanism, and to think through how it is that the U.S. should be using this tool, whether it is being done effectively, whether it is being done, whether it's being overused, how it should be calibrated in the sort of broad scheme of things from a U.S. foreign policy perspective. So this was just announced, and I will say, I'm going to read off to sort of situate everybody who maybe hasn't seen this. I'm going to read off kind of the high level bullet points of the kind of 5 key takeaways from the policy review. But before I do that, I will say everything that I'm about to say should come as no surprise to anybody who's been paying attention to what's been going on for the past 9 months. This is in many ways, I think, and to Tim and I, really just a summary of everything that we have seen and that we have expected to see from the Biden administration with respect to how they were going to utilize sanctions, especially OFAC-administered sanctions. And so, again, everything that we're about to say should not come as any great shock. Nevertheless, it is still significant that this is now sort of out in the world and is now the U.S. is on
Right.
record that this is the way we are going to be administering this tool, or this collection of tools known as sanctions, going forward, at least under the current administration. This could obviously all be undone and changed under a new president, but for now, this is the course that has been charted. So let me read you quickly the high level takeaways, the bullets. So number one, um, adoption of a structured policy framework that links sanctions to a clear policy objective. Another way of saying that is we are not going to just deploy these willy-nilly to show our distaste for certain actors and actions that are being taken
Right.
abroad. And we have talked about this a lot, obviously, because the Trump
Right.
approach was polar opposite of this, and this has been essentially
Right.
adopted since day one of the Biden administration. This has been the approach essentially, and this is now sort of formalized to some degree
Some
that this will be the
uh,
approach.
some adult is going to ask, presumably, what's the goal here, which never seemed to really be asked in previously, or at least not as often as it should be.
Is the tool being deployed for a specific purpose? What is the likelihood that it will achieve said purpose, etc.? That is essentially what this boils down to. Number
Yep.
two, multilateral coordination wherever possible. Also read as we will coordinate with our allies as we deploy sanctions. Again, this is one we've talked about a lot. It is a strong departure from the way the Trump administration was doing this, although it is largely bringing back in line the way that the U.S. has deployed this historically. And actually, later in the episode, we're going to talk when we get to Taiwan about exactly this topic, because I think this is an important one when it comes to Taiwan.
Yep.
But multilateralism reigns again. Again, not surprising. We've talked about this a lot. That is sort of front and center. Calibration of sanctions to mitigate unintended economic, political, and humanitarian impact. We talked about this a lot about this recently with Afghanistan and whether or not there was going to be any action taken directed at further action taken directed at the Taliban, and we surmise that it would likely be very, very tailored whatever action was taken, because there was a high priority on not causing secondary and tertiary consequences that were going to exacerbate the humanitarian crisis that is already ongoing in Afghanistan. And again, this statement, I think, supports that. We have plenty of data points, whether it's Iran, Cuba, Venezuela, other places that are heavily sanctioned, where there has been ample evidence in recent years that perhaps too broad-based a sanctions policy is just tremendously detrimental to the people on the ground, the citizens of that particular country who are the sort of innocent bystanders in this that are not aligned with or even supportive of the ruling regime. That is now sort of firmly in place as a front and center priority of how the sanctions tools will be used. Number four, ensuring sanctions are easily understood, enforceable, and where possible, reversible. We know this all too well, obviously, that sanctions can be somewhat inscrutable to many.
See Cuba.
See the Cuba regime, see some aspects of the Iran regime, the Iran sanctions, and other aspects between the mishmash of statutes, executive orders, regs, and everything, and guidance that OFAC issues. It can be just a really impenetrable mishmash of authorities and guidance, and very difficult to follow, even for sophisticated actors. So this sort of says we're going to do our best to make this a usable framework that people can understand and follow. And then finally, number five, investment in modernizing Treasury sanctions technology, workforce, and infrastructure, building technological capabilities, deepening institutional knowledge, especially relating to digital assets and related services. We're going to get to that in a minute when we talk about virtual currency and ransomware and the like. So those are the five big takeaways. There was a separate document that was also issued that sort of gets into this in more detail. We encourage everybody to take a look at that. And then, as I said, Deputy Secretary Adeyemo was testifying today on the Hill, sort of on the back of this report being released. So let me pause there and throw it to you, Tim. What are your sort of key takeaways from this, now having summarized this? Is this a big deal? Is it not a big deal? What do we take away from this?
So I mean, first off, I totally agree with you that this is OFAC kind of committing to writing what they've really been doing for the past 6 months and what seemed to be their overall attitude towards U.S. sanctions. That said, I thought there were really three big news stories out of this that, even though they were written down, kind of seeing them written down made me think, wow, that is kind of an interesting recognition coming from OFAC. I mean, the first is that overuse of U.S. sanctions are actually undermining their efficacy, and particularly the recognition that that the world is, at least in part, turning away from the dollar because of the overuse of sanctions. I mean, we've seen that in our day jobs, and so we know that really is happening.
Yeah, all the time.
But to see Treasury recognize that, and recognize that as kind of a limit on the use of the sanctions power was I think important, and I'll see if I'll be interested to see if they follow through on that. But I think it is important. I think the second big takeaway I have from this is the recognition that sanctions can have unintended consequences when it comes to humanitarian aid. Now, that is nothing new, and we've talked about it all the time, and we're not the only ones, obviously, who are talking about it. That is, once you put a country under sanctions, even if you carve out a humanitarian exception, it's very hard to actually make that a useful exception. And so the people in the country do get injured because you interfere with humanitarian trade, even if you say that's not what you're trying to do. Treasury recognizes that. Now, this was kind of a big themes type document. There weren't a lot of kind of calls to particular action, and so I think that is one where the devil will be in the details, because it's always been U.S. policy not to interfere with humanitarian aid, but the U.S. has now recognized that despite that policy, it is interfering with humanitarian aid. How do you change that? And one way is to use sanctions a lot less, but it wasn't like this report was accompanied by the repeal of certain sanctions programs. And then the final takeaway was this kind of focus on multilateralism, which we've seen, which is not unique to sanctions in terms of being a Biden administration priority. But again, the devil will be in the details, because I kind of interrupted you when you were summarizing to note that some sanctions programs seem to live forever without any real particular goal, and Cuba is just a great example of that, because Cuba flunks all of their tests, right? I mean, the goal seems to be to overthrow Castro, who's dead. The fact is that nobody around the world except the U.S. Supports the Cuba embargo, and it does interfere with humanitarian aid, whether we like it or not. I mean, we are interfering with Cuba humanitarian aid. So does the government. And this is not to say the Cuban government is a worthy cause or is doing anything to support its own people. I mean, that is separate and aside, and that's really the trick, right? Is that on the one hand, when you say ratchet down the sanctions and repeal the embargo, some people view that as support for a really, by all accounts, odious regime. And it's not. It's just kind of recognizing the limits of sanctions policy. And so it's easy for us who are not kind of facing an electorate to say this doesn't make any sense, and it flunks all of their tests. But with the administration that also has political consequence or political considerations to take into account and does have to answer to the voters, are they willing to take the potential heat of following through on these principles, even when in many instances they might be removing sanctions on regimes that nobody wants to support? They're just doing it because the sanctions themselves aren't being useful, are having unintended consequences, seem to go on without end because there's no goal in sight, and get our allies angry. Like, that's a good reason to remove them, but the message will always be there that you have relaxed the pressure on some sort of awful regime and thereby supported that regime. So I think it's complicated, but I think they're right on the big principles. Whether they can follow through on them in the abstract is the real question.
So I think the one thing that is worth bearing in mind, to use the Cuba example, is that there's going to be a fundamental difference between how these, let's call them philosophical pillars of sanctions deployment for the US government are going to be used on a brand new going forward. This is a new challenge, new issue, new party, new rogue actor that we want to deal with versus someone like Cuba, which is obviously the essentially the oldest, most well-established program that we have in the U.S. And I have a hard time believing that there is going to be, as you said, just kind of a relaxation, because there's now a realization that perhaps the program is not fit for purpose. Because if that purpose is regime change, that is not happening and hasn't happened for decades and decades and decades. If the purpose is something slightly different than that, which is we don't want to be funding a a regime that engages in all kinds of reprehensible conduct, some of which has direct consequences felt in the United States, then that's a little different. Perhaps that does give you room to recalibrate a little bit. But I think for something like Cuba, it's going to be difficult. But I would say that, as you said, on the humanitarian aid side, to my mind, the idea that taking a more tailored approach and a more thoughtful, kind of strategic, how are we connecting the dots here between what we're doing and what we're hoping to achieve, is clearly what has been happening for the past 9 months since the new Treasury team has been on board and the new direction coming from the Biden administration. And then how that continues to play out going forward, it'll be interesting to see. But I will say, for people like us who are oftentimes trying to think through, either just on our own or for the benefit of clients, sort of what are the potential, what could be coming, how will this be perceived, or how will certain things look 3 months from now or 6 months from now or a year from now. I think this is a helpful lens to view some of those things through, because if they stay true to what they're setting out in this document, then it at least gives you, again, a little bit of a strategic and philosophical grounding for what we should expect to be seeing on the Treasury side of things and on the OFAC side of things when it comes to administering these programs, rolling out designations, providing guidance, providing general licenses, etc. Right? And those are massively consequential things across many of these programs. And so I do think that as a sort of organizing principle and a framing device for how this is all going to work going forward, this is useful to have now as a written document. Again, if there's a administration change and 2024 into early 2025, they could literally set fire to this thing and it would just go away and we could revert back to Trump era approach here or something different. But for the foreseeable future, at least, this seems to be the way, and now it's sort of charted out in a nice kind of orderly way in this document.
The one thing that I would add, I mean, is when they are touting the successes of sanctions policy over the last 20 years, I mean, the first success story that they list was the JCPOA, the Iran nuclear deal. And
Right.
I tend to agree with that, right? I mean, it meets all of the tests, right? They had a reason for imposing sanctions on the Iranian regime beyond just the we don't like them. They wanted to stop the nuclear program. They imposed sanctions on the nuclear program. The sanctions were multilateral. They were reversible because they were reversed in the JCPOA as an incentive for changing the behavior that they were trying to change. And so it met all of those tests. They tout as a success story, but the fact of the matter is, as we'll talk about later, I mean, now it's in tatters, and so all of these things all of these principles, although they kind of sound high-minded, are very disputed, and there's a big segment of the United States that strongly disagrees with this view of sanctions.
Yeah, it is a very fragile balance to strike here for sure. And I just do not think, and we talk about this all the time, that this is, at the end of the day, a terribly black or white area. There's a lot of gray and a lot of nuance, and how it gets used and how it gets enforced is really a matter of a lot of discretion, subjectivity, and policy judgment at the end of the day. And that's part of what makes this such a fascinating area and part of what makes it such a confounding, frustrating area to many. So, that is, I don't think, going to change, and I don't think that we're going to be out of a job by virtue of the fact that there's, these new, as you say, kind of pillars, high-minded principles to kind of guide the way the U.S. is going to be deploying this. So, with that, why don't we put that aside for the moment? We will certainly be referencing that today, and I'm sure into the future as we talk through some of these issues. And then let me quickly pivot to item number 2, which is the new guidance that OFAC issued for the virtual currency industry last week. And so, obviously, in the last episode, we talked about the ransomware guidance. This is kind of a close sister, brother, cousin to that guidance, quite frankly, targeted specifically at the virtual currency industry. It's clear that this is something that was in the works for a very long time as well, just like the ransomware guidance was, I believe. For anybody who hasn't downloaded the actual guidance document, I have to tip my cap to the good folks at OFAC and their art department, because they have a kind of a funky sort of teal, and sort of the color scheme is a little, if you're an NBA fan, it's a little mid-90s Charlotte Hornets kind of reminiscent, or early Florida Marlins kind of
I
color
have to
scheme
tell you,
going on.
Brian, when I saw that color scheme and the layout, I came to suspect that a person that I know at OFAC may have been involved in that, because I've worked with him or her on other presentations like that, and that seems to be a particular favorite of theirs. Just a wild guess, but
Perhaps that
I
person
was
shall remain nameless. But
exactly.
anyway, we again, seriously, tip of the cap. It's a little
It was
it's a
good.
little snaz it's
It
a
was
little
good.
snazzier than the typical OFAC advisory document, or
Yep.
guidance document. So this is really, at the end of the day, so this again is kind of a follow-on part of a broader narrative and a broader effort that's going on, obviously, in the space. We're going to talk, the first topic we're going to talk about with DOJ is directly related to the National Cryptocurrency Enforcement Team that has just been announced, obviously, right in lockstep with this as well. These are all things that are being kind of coordinated behind the scenes within the interagency. I think the most important takeaway that I have from this is, so the guidance document, for anybody who hasn't seen it, fully encourage you to download that. The document is sort of a, I have to say, the first half of the guidance document is actually just a really good sort of primer on OFAC, on U.S. sanctions, on how all the different types of sanctions work. For anybody who is less familiar with this, or even just anybody, even for more sophisticated people who need to put training modules together at companies, or for whomever, I would really encourage you to look at this. It's a nice sort of encapsulation of sort of what the OFAC administered sanctions really are, is the first half of the document. And the second half is really best practices for the virtual currency industry that are really run through the prism of the framework, the OFAC compliance framework, the sort of tone at the top, internal controls, testing and monitoring, and every the sort of the pillars that have been now out in publicly available for everybody for now a couple of years. So that's really what the document is. Again, I would say, to my mind, this is a useful sort of marketing awareness raising campaign. Again, targeted at the virtual currency industry. For those who are asleep at the wheel that are in the virtual that are part of the virtual currency industry, the drumbeat
Right.
grows louder that there is more attention being paid by regulators and enforcers. You better be paying attention to these types of things. If you're not, you will have to pay the piper eventually, I think, on this. There are going to be more enforcement actions coming from not just from OFAC, but from DOJ as well, as we're going to talk about in a few minutes. And building on the designation of SUEX, the first, sort of virtual currency exchange that was just sanctioned a couple weeks ago. This is kind of, we're entering a bit of a new era, I think, here with this industry and in these and in the enforcement prioritization of this type of actor. And so, yeah, to me, that's really what this is all about. And again, I encourage anybody who hasn't looked at it, whether you're involved in virtual currency industry or even have any brushes with the virtual currency industry, I would still encourage you to take a look at the guidance document. It's a useful um, tool, I think, for anybody who has any need to be thinking about and aware of what OFAC is currently kind of focused on and aware of and what the priorities are. And yeah, so really those are my sort of big takeaways from it. I don't see too much. Also, some I would also say there was also a FinCEN report that was released in connection with this at the same time, and there are some astounding stats in there about the level of suspicious activity reports that are being submitted on ransomware attacks, and the amount of money that is changing hands in connection with ransomware attacks. The numbers have really gone just through the roof in 2021, and so again, this is, people may be getting tired of hearing this, but this is not something that is going away. This is going to be a focus and a priority for OFAC and others within the government for the foreseeable future, and get used to it and really, I think, wrap your arms around it if you haven't already.
Yeah, I mean, I'm going to wrap items 1 and 2 here, I think, because I think they're completely related to each other. I
Agreed.
mean, I think the OFAC announcement, which had really nice bells and whistles, and I thought was geared towards the public and not really geared toward sanctions nerds, which is important because I think that this is part of a big push by OFAC to focus on the use of cryptocurrency. I think it's probably prompted by the fact that there have been all these ransomware attacks that have been so high profile and that they have been kind of deemed to be one of the priorities in terms of enforcement of the administration. And so I think they're wrapped together on this. I thought that the FinCEN advisory was very interesting, just the stats and all the different ways that they looked at it. And it's clear that Treasury as a whole is focused on crypto's use in ransomware, but not just its use in ransomware. And so, it's not surprising that around the same time, DOJ and Deputy Attorney General Monaco announced the creation of a national cryptocurrency enforcement team, back on October 6th, and at around the same time, John Carlin announced, a DOJ white collar enforcement initiative. One aspect of which was that they're going to start focusing more on sanctions and export control cases, although it's really white collar cases as a whole that they talked about focusing on. I will say, the one piece of it the one piece of the white collar announcement that was a little bit surprising to me was this inclusion of export and sanctions, because I would say from the last administration there was, at least I perceived, a drop off in white collar crime enforcement generally, but not with respect to sanctions and export controls. I really didn't. I thought, particularly when it came to North Korea, Iran, Syria, and even potentially Cuba. There were some Cuba cases that came out of the last administration that there was that focus has been relatively consistent, but they did include it within kind of they're creating teams, they're marshaling resources, and they're going to start going after enforcement in that area. I think it's related to the crypto ransomware push, but I think it's certainly broader than that, and but all of a piece, because I think you've got all kind of levers of the government really focusing on not only sanctions, but sanctions related to crypto, and ransomware attacks and the involvement of cryptocurrency in ransomware attacks and other types of criminal behavior.
Right. So a couple of I'll just respond to a couple of things you said there, and then we can move on. But so number one, I agree completely that the on the OFAC side, this is really meant to be targeted at the public, and we've talked about this now a few different times in recent months. The idea that and the fact that this was well publicized, that in some of these big ransomware attacks, ransoms were in fact paid. They were paid via virtual currency, whether it's Bitcoin or something else. Um, there is clearly now a push to try to get companies and other actors to think twice before doing that. Clearly, you are putting
Oh
yourself
yeah.
at risk. You're putting your own. There is no doubt about that. So it is a think twice, three times, four times before you hit send on the instruction to transmit that to whatever anonymous wallet is provided to you to pay a ransom. That's number one. Number two, I think with the Lisa Monaco announcement of the NCET, as it has been called, the National Cryptocurrency Enforcement Team, and the related John Carlin, who is her deputy in the Deputy Attorney General's office. He's the number two there. They are, I think, clearly. I will say these efforts do not get stood up at DOJ unless there is an expectation of some results. And in particular, in the speech that John Carlin gave, he quoted the fact that there were 150 open export and sanctions criminal cases right now, that 70% of those relate to Iran, China, North Korea, and Russia. Not surprising to hear that that's the distribution, but interesting that they would go public with that. I don't know that that's something that gets talked about all that often. Agree with Tim completely that we did not see sort of a noticeable drop off on the criminal side with export and sanctions cases, often because, and we've talked about this before, these are long gestating cases most of the time. They take a while to investigate. They kind of move along, whether it's 6 months, a year, 18 months, 2 months or more, that you need to investigate these cases properly and get them charged and perhaps make arrests or at least seek arrests in those cases. So they take a long time, but this is clearly a message that we are surging resources. We are, as he said, redoubling efforts to try to bring more of these cases successfully, and to use this as a really kind of important tool in the toolkit to deter these types of actors. And again, I think that kind of goes across from the NCET, sanctions and export. It's all kind of a piece. And then there's another big initiative that was announced with respect to an FBI squad being resident within the fraud section at DOJ that kind of goes along with this as well. This is all part of the effort that's underway now, and I do think there has been, at least anecdotally and to some degree, I've seen hard data on this, the idea that the Trump administration had kind of taken their foot off the gas when it came to kind of corporate and white collar criminal enforcement. Obviously, they designated hundreds and hundreds of different actors over at OFAC because, again, some of those principles that are now sort of memorialized in the new Treasury policy were, the counter was true. It's just like, let's designate as many people as we can, and that's how we're gonna exert pressure, and that's how we're gonna show our displeasure for certain actors without necessarily, and it was maximum pressure without much sort of vector correction or thought about how much this is really achieving any particular purpose. This is now, I think, just making it very cut and dry that has been a full tack back in the other direction, especially in our areas of focus, to really try to hold actors accountable, and to put a lot of resources behind that, to have and we're going to talk in a moment about ZTE and the ZTE forever monitorship, and whether that's actually going to go away, or whether we're going to see what that foretells for other actors that could be in the crosshairs, Huawei, in the future with respect to resolving criminal cases with DOJ. And so, it is a big shift. I think we see these types of shifts, obviously, administration to administration, but this is a real kind of stake in the ground moment, I think, for this new administration at justice and what we're going to see. And so I think that's just a, not a warning shot, but just a, something to be. And I've had this discussion with clients. If there's interest in certain transactions and certain actors and certain other activities that your company may be involved in, if you get a subpoena from a U.S. attorney's office that might be, looking into certain activities relating to these topics, you need to now think through it, I think, in a slightly different way than maybe you would have 2 years ago. I do think that is true, and I think
Well,
that that's something to bear in mind.
I completely agree, and I did say that the activity in our sphere of the white collar practice has been relatively consistent. The one country that I would say is not that's not true with is Russia.
It was Russia.
And Russia was not an enforcement target for the Trump administration, at least as best I could tell in this area. There weren't a lot of sanctions penalties imposed. There were some designations, as you pointed out, Brian, but even with the designations, those often tended to either go away or not really result in a lot of enforcement activity. And so, given the announcements about a week ago, it's probably no surprise that today the FBI raided a house owned by Oleg Deripaska in Washington as part of an investigation that's apparently going on in the Southern District of New York. So you're already seeing signs of this enforcement increase in the sanctions realm, particularly as it relates to Russia.
Right. So with that, I think that's a good pivot to maybe tack over to another, to China, tack back to China for a second. We're going to hit two China topics in a row. And that is, for anybody who has not seen it, I would highly recommend you check out the article that ran in the Wall Street Journal a few days ago relating to the apparent disagreement about whether or not ZTE's court-appointed monitor is going to be extended. For those who have not been, this is, I will say in fairness, just a total mess and has been almost from the beginning. And I'm not speaking from any of my inside knowledge at DOJ. I'm only talking about what's being reported in the press. But to track you back, there was a guilty plea entered and a monitor appointed in 2017. That was supposed to be for a 3-year term. Not only did that term get extended by 2 extra years through 2022, which is now what the dispute is whether it's going to be extended again beyond that now 5-year term. There was obviously the separate issue that the Commerce Department raised about the misleading and inaccurate statements that they were getting from ZTE on a variety of things that were under their purview. They imposed another fine, instituted a whole separate, it's not technically a monitor, but it's essentially a compliance, an outside compliance team that is in place now at ZTE to keep tabs on what is happening there on behalf of the Commerce Department. This is, of course, totally separate from the court-appointed monitor that was put in place via the DOJ resolution back in 2017. And there are, again, I would encourage everybody to read the article in the Wall Street Journal. I don't want to spend too much time talking about some of the more salacious details that are in here, namely the fact that the monitor, James Stanton, I think is widely regarded as having had no business being the monitor in the first place because he had no relevant experience.
He was a personal injury lawyer.
He had close ties to the judge who appointed him. There have been ethical and other concerns that have been voiced by many over time. Those persist, and those are perhaps the loudest they've ever been now if you read this article. I think, nevertheless, he is insisting, apparently, as reported, that his term needs to be extended. Never mind, he is reaping millions and millions and millions of dollars of benefit every year that he remains as the monitor. And also, by the way, it's also being reported that, and this has been widely reported, that ZT is also under investigation for other conduct that has nothing to do with the export violations that they were originally placed under the monitorship for, and that they were originally placed on the entity list for. And those relate to, I believe it's visa fraud and FCPA violations potentially.
Yep.
And apparently, as reported, he is insistent that he should be investigating those things as well, which if that is the case, that would be pretty astounding given the scope of what his original remit was under the terms of that agreement that were signed in 2017, or the terms of that the monitor. And of course, the judge also has kept everything under seal in this case, making it almost impossible to really get at the truth of what is in fact being authorized, what his bills are for his monitorship services. There's a lot of smoke and potentially fire in that regard, and it sounds like the company's not happy, DOJ is not happy, other observers are not happy. Again, two of my former colleagues commented on this, one of whom called this whole situation a train wreck. Um, I will let you all determine for yourselves whether you agree with that when you read the article. But I want to talk about, and Tim can weigh in on this himself. I
I'm
can see
not
he's
going to
got
let it go. I'm not
his
going to let it
reality
go.
TV,
So
his reality TV
this
gears
is
are sort of are grinding
this
right
is
now, and
made for Bravo. This is
he wants
made
to
for
chime in
Bravo.
how there's going to be a Real Housewives of Shenzhen that's made to feature what's going on with the ZT monitorship situation. But I put that aside for 1 minute because I will let Tim do that, obviously, but I'm also going to tee up the separate question, which is really, I think, at the end of the day, the bigger, more consequential question, which is, and this is teased out in the Wall Street Journal article, what is the impact of this going to be in the event that DOJ wants to try to resolve the case against Huawei? And is this going to mean that Huawei is not going to have a monitor as a result of this mess? And I would submit that the answer may very well be yes, that they are not going to, that they are going to potentially be able to wriggle free of a monitor, of a monitorship if they are going to resolve as a result of the fact that this has not turned out, I think, as everybody had hoped or planned at the outset with respect to getting ZTE back on the straight and narrow and having this kind of cleanly administered to have clean lines of sight and oversight into what it is that they're doing and to clean up the initial kind of root cause of what was the issue, which is dealings with Iran, lying to U.S. authorities and others about this, etc. So that's what I want to put. That's what I want to put on the burner for you to consider. But before you do that, obviously, please feel free to
I
freestyle on any of the
I,
other
I
sort of
want to I want to go to
side
the
issues that are
purple
swirling around.
glossy the purple glossy version of this discussion. I mean, first of all, there's just three things about this Wall Street Journal article that I can't let go of. I mean, the first is that apparently the judge wrote a book, and Mr. Stanton, the monitor, described the judge as his mentor in the dedication of a book he wrote. Now, it's the article isn't clear who wrote the book, but the fact that they're already on record as this mentor-mentee relationship before the kind of out of the blue appointment of this person as a monitor was a nice little detail and good reporting. Kudos to the reporters on that. And second, you can't just truncate David Loffman's quote because it is one of the best quotes of all time.
Feel
So
free to give it full airtime.
I'm going to give it full airtime. I mean, so he's described as the former Justice Department official who oversaw ZTE's plea agreement. And he described what is going on now. And remember, the monitor who was appointed out of the blue has already been extended once and is basically now, according to the article, trying to jam ZTE into agreeing to a second extension. And apparently when it said no, he set out a list of all the people he was going to depose and all the things he was going to do to the company that he was monitoring.
He set everybody on a fire. There were like 10 fire drills that were set off as a result of that. By the way, according to the article, DOJ is not in disagreement with the company that the end of that this should be the end in 2022. That should be the end of the term of the monitorship.
Yes. So David's quote is, "This train wreck is a long time coming. While it was entirely appropriate for ZTE to submit to a rigorous monitorship, it's also essential that the process for appointing monitors be above reproach and that monitorships are conducted in a responsible manner with appropriate oversight and accountability." That's a pretty damning quote. And then it's followed by the statement that the Justice Department didn't immediately respond to a request for comment because
nobody went on the record.
Say?
Yeah, nobody went on the record on this. Yeah, exactly.
But my favorite, I have to say, my favorite part of this is when the judge's chambers was asked for a comment on why they did particular things. Their response was because, in connection with this, because.
That's transparent justice for you right there.
We did it because. Why is it under seal? Because.
Yep.
So this is a train wreck, and it always has.
We don't want anybody want anybody to understand how much money is being made off of this monitorship.
Right.
Which, by the way, is typically something that is knowable.
Yes,
You know,
and should be, and that's not to. I mean, there are plenty of monitor ships that work well, and look, the work of a monitor can be very, very taxing, especially when it's a multinational corporation where you've actually got to try and figure out what they're doing in different jurisdictions. So it can be pretty expensive, but this just seems to go beyond the pale on that. But I will say a couple of things with respect to the Huawei question because one thing about CTE that we may have commented on at the time. I think we've commented on it at some point in the podcast. So there's another monitor for ZTE, and I think the reason that the Commerce Department still has a monitor that's in place, and I think the reason that the Commerce Department monitor went into place is because there was a realization back, several years ago that the way that this monitorship was set up and the capabilities of the monitor who was appointed by his friend the judge were not up to the task, and so the Commerce Department appointed a separate monitor, and I think that tells me that the concept of monitors has not been given up on. It's just that the way this monitorship went down created issues. Now, that's not to say that all monitorships are appropriate and all monitorships are great and that they don't have problems, but I think this one may actually make them more cautious with respect to Huawei and a monitor, but it might be caution in the process as to how the monitor is appointed as opposed to the concept of a monitor
yeah,
generally.
I think that's a fair point. And to Tim's point as well, we know very well we have colleagues who have served as DOJ appointed, court appointed monitors. When done right, it can be a really incredibly valuable tool, a win-win for the government and the company, quite frankly, if done correctly. I think all evidence here is that this has not gone according to plan or as hoped at the outset. I think to your point, Tim, that is an interesting kind of flip side to the insight or the thought that perhaps this will make it harder to get a monitor in place with Huawei if that's what DOJ seeks. Perhaps, though, maybe not. Maybe you're right.
Right.
Maybe there are some lessons learned here about how it gets structured, how the appointment process would work. It would not be done in Texas in any event in this district, so there would be no issue with the same judge having any impact on that. It would be in Brooklyn or in all likelihood. So that is very different, I think, and could very well be is still in play, I think, in light of what we talked about last time with the resolution with the CFO, with Ms. Meng, and the admissions that she made and what they're positioning for. What the end game is there with Huawei, it's still unclear, but it could very well be that is the end game. I would say, that it'll be interesting to, obviously, Huawei has sort of handled things very differently than ZTE. ZTE was placed on the entity list first, and then immediately began cooperating to try to get off the entity list, and then as a byproduct of that, resolve the criminal case against them. That is very different than Huawei, who has been fighting tooth and nail at every step and has been resistant to any suggestion that the U.S. has any right to be weighing in, judging, or criticizing anything that they've done. So it is a very different posture. It's kind of in a very different place, and they've taken a very different approach. So who knows where that will ultimately land at the end of the day? But it will be fascinating to see because that is clearly the closest kind of you know analog, I think, in that we know about. Obviously, there could be others, but certainly the closest analog. Huawei is a bigger company. Any kind of resolution that would be reached with Huawei would be a bigger deal at the end of the day, would have bigger impact. I mean, if you look at what has happened to ZTE by virtue of this resolution, the entity listing that went into has been on and off a couple times in the last few years, the commerce resolution, the commerce, oversight that's happening now, it has diminished them certainly in the US and perhaps even globally if you look at the numbers. Huawei, it's still hard to say, although some evidence suggests that they have had similar struggles as a result of the entity listing and the criminal cases in the U.S. But time will tell sort of where the criminal cases go for Huawei and what the end game is there.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the way Huawei responded to enforcement actions was informed by what happened to ZTE, for better or for worse. And I think that Huawei saw that when ZTE cooperated, things went south, and this monitorship was a real problem.
There's a lot of
And
reasons for that, to be clear. I
yeah,
think
yeah, yeah. No, no, no,
it's not
no,
just the
no.
monitor's fault. There's a lot of reasons that
Oh,
things have
I
been bumpy
agree.
for
I agree. But
ZTE, obviously.
I think the message, and I'm not saying that it's the right message, but I think
Right.
one of the messages is that Huawei took out of watching the ZTE enforcement action was, if you cooperate, if you eventually cooperate anyway, because that ZTE did not immediately cooperate, but cooperation is not a viable strategy. I think that Huawei learned that lesson. And again, I'm not saying that it's the right lesson, but I think it's certainly the one that Huawei took it away from. Before we leave this topic, I do want to go back to this quote, because I want to make sure that I get it right. But the courtroom deputy for the judge who appointed the monitor was asked to provide redacted copies of the monitor's report, and was asked why he was refusing, and that was what he said, because to. So we don't know why these are not being provided, other than because.
Right. And to be clear, for those who are unfamiliar, in the US legal system, the presumption is for openness and transparency, and
Right.
things are only kept under seal and out of view of the public in
Right.
exceptional circumstances. And we
Right.
don't even know why technically they are
Right.
being kept under seal at the moment, uh, other than, the cynical view would
Right.
be that nobody wants to see how much money the monitor is making, and and all of the demands that are being made, which, if held up in the light of other similarly situated monitors, one would probably have to question what is and is not sort of reasonable and appropriate, and whether
Right.
this is being done in sort of a properly at the proper scale and scope and depth that it needs to be.
Right. I mean, in our system, transparency is the norm, and you don't need to give a reason.
Correct.
If it's transparent, you can just say because. But when you're sealing stuff from the public, and particularly documents that like this, where there would seem to be a public interest, you're supposed to give a narrow, compelling reason for why the documents are being
Correct.
kept from the public. So
Correct.
that's
So
when you're not allowed to say just because.
we will definitely be coming back to this one at some point. It may be a few months before there's any outcome here, or we see where this shakes out. But and also, I would add final thought before we move to the last topic of the day. Obviously, difficult for the Biden era DOJ to sort of back away from or be seen as like pro ZTE. That is a tough pro China, pro ZTE. That is a
Yep.
tough dynamic, a tough. They're a little bit between a rock and a hard place there. I do not envy my friends and former colleagues who are involved in this. It is not an easy place to be, to try to find a way through this, to kind of thread the needle, to strike that right balance, but not be seen as being sort of soft on ZTE or China more broadly, or sort of validating of any of the very concerning things that they have unquestionably done in the past. So it's a really fraught situation, very difficult, and could have big implications beyond this. So we will keep a close watch on this one.
Speaking of fraught situations,
Yes,
let's go to Taiwan.
let's go to Taiwan.
Um, so, this is not really a sanctions or export controls topic, but it could quickly become
Yeah,
one. So,
yeah.
so basically, in Taiwan right now, there is a dangerous game that is going on, where the U.S. and its allies. So you mentioned this in the intro, Brian. I mean, this is a multilateral effort to support Taiwan on the one hand, because Taiwan is, in China's view, is a province of China that it has a separate government, but it's all part of the same country. That is, it's not does not contradict the U.S. view, but the U.S. I think treats Taiwan as more of an independent province than perhaps China would agree to. Not perhaps, but definitely than China would agree to. And some of our allies, including the UK, including Canada, and including Australia, and including Japan, support that view. And so what's happening right now is you have a buildup of the Chinese Navy. And I was reading some of the articles about this and kind of astonished at how quickly China has gone from kind of a very minor navy that really did not rival that of a, or did not resemble that of a superpower to really the second biggest navy in the world, and in many ways the biggest navy by some measures. And much of that buildup has been out of the desire to flex its muscles with respect to Taiwan. And so you have this situation where the US continues to have, some presence in Taiwan, where, in a very narrow strait between the island of Taiwan and the east coast of China, you have US, Canadian, Australian, Japanese warships sailing through the Strait of Taiwan, which antagonizes the Chinese, obviously. And at the same time, you've got China doing flyovers of Taiwan and building up its naval presence in that region. This seems like a situation that is not going to end well. And I think the one thing that I would add to that before kind of throwing it over to you, Brian, is there's also a recent roadmap for this sort of situation in Hong Kong. Hong Kong's status is a little bit different than Taiwan's status, since the Chinese negotiated that status, and they actually have a treaty with the British that formalizes the status of Hong Kong, although that status seems very different today. With Taiwan, I mean, the status of Taiwan is a relic of the Civil War in China, back in the 1940s, when the Communist Chinese Party took over China, and the nationalist Taiwanese, or what was then the Chinese government, kind of fled to Taiwan and set up shop there, and have created essentially a separate government, and for quite a long time have acted like a separate country. And so, you have this situation where China wants a one China policy, considers Taiwan to be part of China the same way they considered Hong Kong to be part of China, and has acted on that very recently to really clamp down on the autonomy of Hong Kong. It is a little bit ominous as to what's going on in Taiwan with that as a backdrop.
Right. We see, I think the Hong Kong parallels are somewhat striking, although this is in some ways different, but close enough. And in a recent example where we have seen things obviously deteriorate in terms of the way that the U.S. has recognized Hong Kong, and the way that China has sort of co-opted Hong Kong to some degree with the national security laws and other actions that they've taken, and the resulting measures that the U.S. has taken, whether it be on the sanctions front, on the export controls front, or what have you. So to me, the most interesting thing here, from obviously there's a lot going on in the background. There's the threat of military engagement. There's other things going on that are a little bit outside of the purview of what we cover on the pod here, but I think are all informing perhaps the way that the U.S. is trying to formulate policy here to some degree. Revelations that came up recently about U.S. having some military personnel that had been in Taiwan, sort of conducting training and advising in Taiwan for the last several months, last year, et cetera, inflaming the situation to some degree in the eyes of the Chinese government. So to me, the interesting question is, again, in light of what we just talked about at the top of the show about new sort of, philosophical underpinning of our approach to sanctions is multilateralism. There is clearly at the moment, at least, multilateral support for the U.S. with respect to the way it's trying to support Taiwan and push back against China. And that includes a lot of different countries. That's close allies like the UK, Australia, New Zealand, but also Canada, but also India, Japan to some degree as well, that have been sort of part of these military exercises or other things that have been going on in the region, at least, that have some connection to the situation in Taiwan. So to me, the interesting question is, if the U.S. were to decide or were to float the idea of exercising some kind of sanctions authority targeting China with respect to Taiwan, we're trying to impose, we've seen entity list entity listings targeting the South China Sea and activities in the South China Sea. Could we see something that would be similar here, that would be similar under whether it would be, I don't know what authority it would be. Could it be Magnitsky Act? Could it be something else? Congress could potentially act on its own here too to arm OFAC and state and others with the power to take steps here. I wouldn't be. That's We saw that with Hong Kong. We could see that here theoretically, to the extent that Congress can agree on anything these days. It can agree on China. That's really it. So we could see that. I think there's a lot of fascinating directions it could go. I don't really have a clear sense of what's going to happen, but bear in mind, at least from the on the OFAC side of things, we are going to, and on the White House side of things, we are going to see. I think this filtered through the what we talked about at the top on the Treasury sanctions policy and sanctions review. I do think this will be one of the first fascinating tests of how that plays out in real time under that new kind of philosophical umbrella. Again, putting aside what Congress may do and what that may enable President Biden and Treasury to do as a result, but it's really, it could go in any number of directions. Many of them not good, decidedly not good. But it's one to keep an eye on. One I think we will probably be steering back toward, and part of the reason we wanted to include it is we haven't really talked too much about Taiwan. We talked during the Trump to Biden transition about a few activities that were happening with respect to Taiwan and how that was potentially going to play out and be perceived by China and what that would mean under the new administration. But I think it's time to put China back in view. I mean, to put Taiwan back in view with respect to China and with respect to our sanctions policy and our foreign policy more broadly, obviously, and to just keep that on everybody's radar, because there could be a lot that happens here in the coming 6 to 12 months.
A lot happening in Taiwan. I mean, it
Yeah.
really is. It's worth watching.
Yeah. So with that, that's our final sort of full topic of the day. And we will now pause for the lightning round side effect, and we're going to hit two topics in the lightning round side effect. So topic number one, Venezuela. We are going to really shift gears here for a second to talk about something we have not hit on at all today, which is Venezuela, and specifically the announcement yesterday that Alex Saab, as he is known, a Colombian citizen who was closely aligned with the Maduro regime. He is sometimes referred to as a Maduro financial fixer or a Maduro financier, was extradited to the U.S., to the Southern District of Florida, on charges relating to money laundering and FCPA in connection with violations of the FCPA, in a scheme to pay bribes to take advantage of the Venezuelan government's favorable exchange rates. And so that in and of itself, you may say, well, what does that have to do with sanctions? What does that have to do with what I hear you two talk about all the time? That's important for the following reasons, in my view. So what happened immediately in the aftermath of this is that, first of all, for those who were not aware of this, so Mr. Saab was put on the SDN list about 2 years ago, a little over 2 years ago, right around, I think on the same day he was indicted on these charges. He was arrested about a year ago in Cape Verde. No sanctions related charges, which, as we talked about before, you cannot extradite on sanctions related charges basically anywhere because they are seen as political crimes, and you're never going to get extradition. So good old fashioned money laundering and and fraud, that'll fly in most places that we have extradition treaties with. And so that is in fact what he was extradited on. And the Maduro regime, since the time he was arrested, had put up quite a fight to try to portray him as a political prisoner, and that he should have diplomatic immunity and a variety of other arguments in an effort to not distance themselves from him, but sort of really go all in on trying to put pressure on Cape Verde to prevent him from being extradited. Well, that didn't work. He's now been extradited to the United States, and immediately upon the announcement that he was being extradited, the Venezuelans arrested, or some may say kidnapped, 6 oil executives that are in country in Venezuela who had previously been under house arrest there. This is perhaps another example of sort of hostage diplomacy that we talked about with Ms. Meng, and what China did with the 2 Michaels and the 2 Canadian citizens that they were holding, and some This may be another example of that. We talked about that a little bit the other day, but it is clear that the Maduro regime is not happy about the fact that Mr. Saab is now in U.S. custody and that he is now going to be facing charges in Southern District of Florida, and in all likelihood is going to be leaned on pretty heavily to start cooperating and perhaps to avoid a big jail sentence in the course of doing that. And the other piece that goes along with this is that there had been some early stage talks in Venezuela with the U.S. backed opposition party and the Maduro regime to talk about having and holding free and fair elections, something we've talked about a lot on the pod, which is clearly the ultimate end game of the United States with respect to Venezuela. And those talks are now done for the at least for the time being in light of Mr. Saab's extradition. So with that, I will throw to you, Tim, to weigh in on what you think the impact of this will be, and with respect to U.S. Venezuela policy and perhaps beyond.
Well, I mean, I think it's important, although I think how it plays out will depend a lot on private conversations that are probably currently ongoing between Mr.
Mr.
Saab's
Saab and his
lawyers and the
lawyers
Justice
and the
Department.
DOJ. Yeah.
Yeah, but I think that the one piece of the Saab story that I wanted to comment on is that the talks that were going on in Mexico, and those talks I think were critical to the U.S. sanctions program in Venezuela, because I think the Biden program, or the Biden administration, unlike the Trump administration, is really likely trying to bargain away the sanctions in exchange for free and fair elections. I think the Trump administration was trying to bargain away the sanctions too, but they were trying to bargain away the sanctions in exchange for Maduro's overthrow. And I think, as we've talked about many times, getting
Regime
a
change is
regime change is just really hard to effectuate through sanctions policy, because no government is going to negotiate itself away. And so that you might get them to negotiate themselves into an election, particularly one where they think they can win, but you aren't going to be able to get them to negotiate themselves out of power. And so I think that those talks were really very linked up to the sanctions in Venezuela. I think they probably were done under some sort of U.S., certainly blessing, and the U.S. was very interested in those talks. And so it'll be interesting to see whether Maduro walks away from those talks for good, or whether there's a suspension in those talks. I agree that the hostage diplomacy here is also worth keeping an eye on, because it is very similar, or it seems very similar to what happened in China after the attempted extradition of Mrs. May.
and what we've seen in the past in Iran and other places as well. Agree completely. So yeah, and again, just harkening back to again where we opened with just sort of the new philosophical underpinnings of U.S. sanctions policy, at least as administered by Treasury and OFAC, the idea that there are sort of clearly articulated goals, and whatever is being sought has got sort of a defined purpose and end game in place. I think what Tim said is exactly right. The idea of working toward free and fair elections, clearly the end game here for the U.S. And now, at least for the time being, that is going to be put on hold, and we'll have to see where it goes from here. So it's something to keep an eye on in Venezuela. And then with that, let's move quickly to our final topic, one of our favorite topics, which is JCPOA 2.0, and whether or not we may need to start referring to it as JCPOA 0.0,
Right.
perhaps.
RIP, I
Yeah.
think, is probably where it's headed. It's very hard to tell. I mean, I think you pointed out on the last podcast that, if the new Iranian regime wanted to end this process, it could easily do it by walking away, and it hasn't walked away, which is at least some evidence that they don't intend to end this process. But boy, they're coming very close. So they, there are no talks currently going on in Vienna. It appears that that President Raisi and his, and the government officials that he's charged with pursuing this line of negotiations have now gone to the EU and tried to essentially take their case to the EU outside of the Vienna process. Not with much success, at least to read the news articles about it. It is kind of a weird tack to try and go outside the process. That said, I mean, today Secretary of State Blinken met with the head of the IAEA. They did discuss Iran according to the readouts from the meeting, and so there is something happening there. But boy, as the clock ticks, and we've said this a lot, it gets less and less likely because the benefits to the U.S. of a deal are less, and because the end date of the temporary solution that was the nuclear agreement gets closer to being over, and so it gets really hard to jump back into the deal. And if the complexity there is that then you say, well, why don't they just negotiate a new end date? Well, if you negotiate a new end date, everything goes on the table, I think, from the Iran side, because Iran is going to say, if I'm going to extend this, what are you going to give me? And then you have a whole new negotiation, and you really can't. I think that's going to be untenable.
Right, not to mention the fact that this is widely perceived as being just a stall tactic by the new regime in Iran to be able to continue to enrich uranium over the
Right.
course of a number of months without proper IAEA oversight. And I think that was the point that Secretary Blinken and the Director General of the IAEA made in their joint comments today or yesterday relating to that and trying to keep the pressure on Iran to say, look, we are ready to resume indirect talks in Vienna. You're the ones that are stalling. This sort of offshoot talks that are being discussed with the EU officials in Brussels or something else is it just seems like a sort of frolic and detour here and something that's not going to be ultimately very productive. So I think the bottom line is if you were to ask us at any point over the last 6+ months what our scale of 1 to 10, where we thought we were in terms of likelihood of a deal being reached on JCPOA 2.0, I think we would have been not at the far end of, it's a certainty, but I think probably 5 or slightly above for the most part. I think I'm probably below that now. I think I am now skeptical that there is going to be a deal as time has worn on, and sooner or later, one side or the other is just going to completely walk. I mean, look, you can say completely walk away, and then that could prompt action by the other side if they say, "Oh, wow, maybe we pushed too far." But I do think that we're getting close to a walkaway point one way or the other, and I now have personally sort of dimmer views that there's going to be a deal and a resuscitation potentially of the sanctions relief that had been negotiated originally.
Yeah, I mean, that's basically where I am. I still keep in the back of my head the idea that the Iranians are still calculating economic figures with the sanctions lifted, and showing that their economy would get a huge boost if the sanctions were
Right.
lifted. And they really do have strong economic reasons to want the sanctions to be lifted. Um, but every day that passes, I get more pessimistic about
Right.
that ever getting to an agreement.
I agree with that. So in any event, we've had a lot of discussions over the last couple months since Raisi came into office about what was maybe happening, about to happen. Still, basically nothing has happened the last few months,
Right?
but
Nothing.
it is of such a significance that I think we do keep coming back to it time and again. We keep getting asked about it out again in our day jobs. So I think it is something that we're obviously still watching closely. Everybody should keep an eye on. But for now, nothing new to report, and that is likely not good for the prospects of resuscitating any kind of a deal going forward. So with that, I think that wraps us for today. That's the end of the lightning round, the end of the episode. We covered a lot of ground actually in just a little over an hour. And yeah, any sort of final thoughts before we part for the day, Tim?
Covered a lot of ground, and I'll be interested to see how this new kind of statement of principles or mission statement from OFAC plays out in the real world.
Yeah, it will be interesting to see as the rubber meets the road and as we have perhaps more tangible data points to support some of these pillars or these findings that came out of the review, what that is in fact going to look like and how that is going to work in practice. We will obviously be keeping close watch on that, and we'll be sharing our thoughts, I'm sure, as things evolve over time. So, with that, thanks everybody as always for joining us. We'll be back in a couple weeks in early November. And in the meantime, hope everybody stays safe, stays healthy, stays sanctions free, and go Red Sox.
Stay sanctions free, everybody.
Thanks. Bye, everybody.